with HIV and networks of people living with HIV are playing an incredible role in this important resource for measuring, stopping, and acting on stigma and discrimination at community level. Today's thematic focus of this webinar is understanding the leadership of people living with HIV, and in particular, key population engagement in the Stigma Index. And I'm joined today by a really incredible group of experts who have been working on the Stigma Index at many levels. Today I'm joined by Sibongile Nkose, who's the co-director of the Global Network of People Living with HIV, Omar Sharif, not the famous movie actor, but the program manager for the People Living with HIV Stigma Index at GMP+. Dong Do Dang, who's the national coordinator of the Vietnam Network of People Living with HIV, or VPN+. Jumoke Patrick, who's the executive director of the Jamaican Network of Seropositives, or JN+. And last but not least, Laurel Sprague, who is the Chief of Community Mobilization and Youth Engagement at UNAIDS. So without further ado, because we do want to keep this to an hour and present really rich information and also have an opportunity for some strong questions and answers from the audience, which I can already see is an excellent group. I will introduce Sibongile, who's going to give us some opening reflections and thoughts to open our webinar this morning. Sibongile, take it away.
Thank you, Sophie. It is a pleasure to be with you today, and I welcome you all. This is a very important space to reflect, to shape, and to commit to the future of the Stigma Index. Stigma continue to be pervasive in the lives of people living with HIV in all their diversity. It denies us of our dignity to enjoy our freedom and the right to fully live a quality of life. 10 years since the launch of the first Stigma Index, and it continues to be one of the groundbreaking tools in which both the local, the regional, and the global networks document HIV-related stigma and discrimination, which is important to ending stigma. The Stigma Index places PLHIV leadership at the center of the HIV response. And we've seen that it has resulted in our communities being the drivers of policy change in our own countries. It has also demonstrated that as communities, we have the skills and the expertise for the development process of gathering evidence and data. This is empowering for our communities, as it shows that there's no HIV response without us. To date, the Stigma Index has expanded and places emphasis on intersectionality of stigma. We at GNP Plus are very proud to work alongside our colleagues at ICW and UNAIDS. We would also like to thank and acknowledge the funding and the technical support from PEPFAR and USAID. And lastly, from my side, both the 2021 political declaration and the global AIDS strategy have made ambitious commitments to scale up community-led responses in prevention, treatment, monitoring, and advocacy to ending discrimination. So there is a clear path. Now the onus is on us on how do we use the Stigma Index data and the evidence to achieve these commitments. I'm looking forward today to the discussions on how do we use the Stigma Index to ending stigma and discrimination. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for those really inspiring words and call to action for us. And now I'd like to have Omar give us a little bit of a background about people living with HIV leadership and an overview. Omar.
Thank you so much, Sophie. Is the slides up now, the image? I couldn't see it. All right, okay. So greetings from Jakarta. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening for colleagues. Thank you so much for making the time to be with us for this webinar. I want to use this opportunity to share our work in documenting our experience on stigma and discrimination, and use it to advocate for a life of dignity, safety, and quality as a whole human being. But firstly, let us take a brief look back in the history of PLHIV Stigma Index program. It was started in 2008 as an empowerment initiative among PLHIV community. It was started as a PLHIV-driven process led by GNP Plus and ICW with support from UNH and IPPF. And the idea back then is to create a tool to document our experience in a way that is acceptable from scientific perspective, and to use the documentation for advocacy. So it was very clear that PLHIV Stigma Index was always meant to go beyond research activity. And in 2020, with the launch of the new standardized methodology and process, we reframe the process or the implementation as a continuous journey of our fight towards a life free of stigma and discrimination. With that, please allow me to take you to an overview of our journey. So as you can see in the image in your screen, by implementing a PLHIV Stigma Index, the first key steps in the journey is to mobilize our community. And when I talk about community, it's PLHIV community with all of its diversity, including women living with HIV, young people living with HIV, and also people who use drugs, MSM, and gay men, sex workers, and transgender people living with community to work together in producing evidence using our own experience. It is a key step to have everyone unite and contribute to our struggle, as only when we united, we are at our best in terms of strength to demand for a better life. And then the next steps in the journey is a capacity development process. And again, this is an opportunity for PLHIV community to build scientific evidence using a rigorous methodology to ensure quality of data and results from the process. So again, this whole process really key to build a stronger PLHIV group at national level to deliver its mandate in fighting on behalf of PLHIV community. The next steps of the journey is to build strong partnership with all key stakeholders at country level, including from government sectors, civil society, and key population groups, and also academics, human rights organizations, as well as development partners working at country level to ensure buy-ins both from political and programmatic angle, and to make sure that the results will be recognized and used widely in policy and program development within the national AIDS response. And then once the research is completed, we move on to the next steps of the journey, which is to use the finding for advocacy. It is very, very important to use the strategic partnership built earlier in the process when we're doing the advocacy works to ensure we have a various channel available to amplify our advocacy messages. And the last steps in this journey cycle is to monitor the impact of our advocacy, because we need to ensure, and for us to be able to do that, we need to ensure there is a monitoring mechanism set in place to see any improvement, any progress in policy and program intervention. And right now, with the arrival of a community-led monitoring initiative, community has a strategic opportunity as well as resources to monitor the impact. So the journey, we describe it as a full cycle. And right now, with commitment from donors and funders, and their recommendation to do stigma index every 2 or 3 years, this cycle then clearly fits to be put in place as a continuous journey for PLHIV community to have a life free of stigma and discrimination. Thank you so much, and over to you, Sophie.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Omar. That's really important and a good conceptual framework to think about this cycle that's really driven by networks of people living with HIV towards a future free of stigma and discrimination. And now I'd like to ask Jumoke to share some reflections from the country implementation in Jamaica.
Thank you very much. Will my slides be shared?
To ask our technical behind the scenes.
Yes,
team.
coming up.
All right, I appreciate it. And in the meantime, hi guys, good morning from Kingston, Jamaica. My name is Jumoke Patrick. I'm the Executive Director for the Jamaica Network of Seropositive here in Jamaica, which is a network of people living with HIV, the largest in the country, and if I dare say in the Caribbean. Next slide, please. Right, so a little bit about us. We're a network, as I said earlier. We started as a network and we not transform, but we also are a registered NGO here in Jamaica since 1999, but started in 1996. We represent and advocate for the rights and concerns of people living with HIV here in Jamaica. We're led by a board of directors who are only people living with HIV, and over 90% of the staff at JN Plus are people living with HIV. We have a membership of over 700 PLHIV that are registered and are active in our network in terms of what we do and participating in programs and activities. And we definitely, a big part of our work is the full involvement and inclusion in all aspects of society, including the national HIV response for people living with HIV. Next slide, please. So in relation to the stigma index, this would have been our second stigma index study survey being done in Jamaica. So this is stigma 2.0. So for this particular survey, we started in 2019, yes. 557 persons across the island, people living with HIV, were contacted and surveyed for the index. And if you know of Jamaica, know of how we are set up in terms of a country, we are set up in regions, health regions, and I use health regions. So we have the southern region, the southeast region, the western region, and the northeast region. And so what you're seeing in my first bullet point is the number of persons living with HIV from each of those regions that made up the stigma index study for 2019. 2019-2020, and we also have a breakdown of the number of people living with HIV as per key population. So 56 of those were transgender, non-binary, non-bisexual men who have sex with men, 91, non-bisexual women having sex with women, 60, bisexual people, 35. We had over 212 cisgender women, and we had 92 cisgender men. Next slide, please. So from this study, there were some very important and key findings, and some of these are reflected on your slides. So, based on the time, we weren't able to highlight everything, but I believe these were some of the important ones that are worth highlighting for this particular webinar. So in terms of the first bulletin, we recognize that when asked if persons experience some form of stigma and discrimination related to the HIV status, not including the healthcare in the past 12 months, 183 participants, which is 33%, answered in the affirmative. 268, which is 48% of those reported ever having experienced stigma and discrimination in relation to their HIV status. 53% of the participants reported their HIV status makes them feel guilty, makes them feel ashamed, makes them feel worthless and or dirty, 53%. And 52% reported carrying out at least one self-isolating behavior due to their HIV status within the past 12 months. This for us has been a highlight at JN Plus in terms of our work when we look at self-stigma and when we look at dignity. So this stood for us and was very concerning when we saw the data at that time, and continue to do work around self-stigma and dignity. 412 of the participants, which 74%, noted that they find it difficult to tell anybody else about their HIV status, and 451, which is 81%, reported that they hide their HIV status from others. Next slide, please. So on this slide, we wanted to focus on what are the access to justice or redress and report opportunities that people living with HIV know about that exist in Jamaica. So these 3 points are really centered around that, where only 43% of participants reported knowing whether laws exist in Jamaica in terms of specific protection of people living with HIV. The study indicated that 208 people are aware of the Jamaica Anti-Discrimination System for HIV, which is a report and redress system where persons living with HIV can report HIV-related discrimination. Of that number, only 28 persons use it to report cases of stigma and discrimination, and only 16 participants reported receiving satisfactory results from the system. Among those participated who sought out non-HIV care within 12 months of the study, only 26% usually disclose their HIV status to their healthcare providers. Next slide, please. So based on the findings and based on the analysis were done, there were some key recommendations that came out of the survey, the study, in 2020 when the report was produced. So it was noted that civil society organization and the government should conduct outreach and awareness campaign through the media, town hall meetings, etc., about their protection, expectation for people living with HIV, such as sexual and reproductive health rights. Two particular important topics for outreach are the Jamaica Anti-Discrimination System and the National HIV Workplace Policy that we have here in Jamaica. There needs to be more promotion of the Jamaica Anti-Discrimination System for HIV, where persons can get quick redress options as people living with HIV. This would increase the number of people living with HIV accessing redress and reduce the number of discrimination and gender-based violence that are happening across the island. Healthcare centers should train their staff, including doctors and nurses, but also auxiliary health center employees, on how best to serve people living with HIV and members of the key population. And in relation to this point, it was not necessarily doctors and the nurses that were doing the discrimination, HIV-related discrimination, but more so the other non-health staff that works at these facilities that usually interact with people living with HIV, such as the security guard, the receptionist, the porters, the ancillary staff, etc. Next slide, please. Civil society should serve as a link between people and the government. Advocacy is important in this approach in terms of the stigma index, ranging from high-level meetings with government officials, having town hall meetings, having newspaper articles, letter to the editors, etc., in terms of promoting advocacy and outreach campaigns. Civil society organizations should advocate for the government to pass laws that protect marginalized communities. For example, a comprehensive anti-discrimination law, redefine rape in the Sexual Offences Act to protect all people, develop a policy that defines gender inclusivity in legal terms, and reference that policy in all future takes precedence. Next slide, please. So key population engagement is also something that we recognize is important in terms of the recruitment occurred in multiple methods, list-based recruitment through the network. And this is going back to the methodology, recruitment through public and private clinics, snowball recruitment, PLHIV asking other PLHIV, would they be interested in participate? So those were how we got key population engagement in the research. Next slide, please. The sample was a purposive one in terms of and we are challenges now. The purposive one rather than a random sample of all PLHIV in Jamaica, which means we cannot be generalized as the experience of all people living with HIV. And it was purposive in the sense that when our data collectors, which were people living with HIV, showed up at the health center or any of our partners, persons were recommended or informed about the survey by the healthcare worker or by the individual as to whether or not they'll be interested. There is a possibility that that particular person may not inform a person living with HIV about the research and may only choose those persons who they believe would provide a favorable response in terms of the facility and stigma and discrimination. So we believe that was a challenge. And almost all the recruitment of people living with HIV happened at clinics across the island. And so that was something that we had challenges with. A few came from our civil society partner, including Jane Plus as a network of people living with HIV. But we believe that limited our recruitment in terms of having most of the participants that were on a clinic or in a clinic on a particular day for treatment and care. Next slide, please. And that's it, I believe. Thank you. So you can contact us. Those are our contact information, our website for further information if you want to know more about us. Thank you very much for listening.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jumoke. You've given us a lot to think about, some really practical and pragmatic examples from your experience in Jamaica, which I'm sure people are going to be having some questions about and wanting to explore a bit further. So please definitely go ahead and those who are in the audience, feel free to put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll turn it over now to Dong from Vietnam, who's going to share about the experience of the implementation there.
Yeah, thank you, Sophie. Yeah, greeting from Hanoi, Vietnam. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. So thank you so much, our GNP Plus, and I'm very happy to have the chance to present the Stigma Index implementation here in Vietnam. Next slide, please. Yeah, this slide shows you brief information on the VNP Plus. VNP Plus is a Vietnam network of people living with HIV. And it's an organization run by 4 people living with HIV. The network was officially formed in 2008, and it was legally registered under the legal name of the Action Center for People Living with HIV in 2009. And currently, there are 167 groups of people living with HIV who are members of the network all over the country. Yeah, and the network has been conducted the first round of Stigma Index in the year 2011. And the second round of the Stigma Index has been conducted in 2014. And in 2020, VNP Plus undertook a third round of the Stigma Index to analyze the stigma discrimination currently faced by HIV in Vietnam, and to establish what positive and negative changes have taken place in recent years. Yeah, next slide, please. This slide shows you the summary of methodology for geographical coverage. The 2020 Stigma Index was conducted across 7 provinces. These provinces were purposefully selected to represent a range of geographic and economic conditions, as well as the high HIV prevalence, accounting for an estimated 38% of the HIV population here in Vietnam. And those provinces were also selected to represent a range of HIV service infrastructure and presence of the international donors. For the sampling size, the targeted sample size for 2020 Stigma in Vietnam was 1,622 participants. This target was determined using reason from previous round of Stigma Index in 2014, based on the proportion of participants who reported avoidance of healthcare at the local clinic or hospital due to the anticipated stigma regarding HIV status. And we use the precision-based sample size calculation with adjustment made for clustering effect and estimated non-response rate. And in 2020 Stigma Index, we use the combination of two sampling strategy. The first one is venue-based sampling from selected public, private, and community-based health facilities. And the second one is the limited chain referral. Yeah. Next slide, please. Yeah, the key finding, yeah, the data is quite big and the result is very rich, and we just pick up some of the key findings and show you in this slide. And the results show a high level of the internalized stigma, including the feeling of the guide. It's about 37%. And 42% is the feeling of worthlessness, and 41% is the feeling of shame, and 39% is feeling of dirty. And many PLHIV reported isolated themselves or avoiding common activities due to the HIV status during the past 12 months. And 27% of respondents choose to isolate themselves from family or friends. 18% of respondents choose not to attend social gathering, and it's very important. 12% of participants reported choosing not to seek healthcare over the past 12 months due to the HIV status. And another finding is related to the mental health diagnosis. 18% respondents reported receiving a mental health diagnosis in the past year. And when asked about symptom experience in the past 2 weeks, almost one half of all participants reported feeling nervous, anxious, or on edge, and almost 1/4 reported feeling down, depressed, or hopeless. 27% had a symptom consistent with the depression and anxiety. And the third one is the intersectional stigma attributed to the other aspect of their identity. And when we evaluating HIV-related stigma by key population, the transgender women generally reported the highest level of experience, community level, and healthcare-related stigma than other groups. For example, 23.5% of transgender women reported experience of stigma in the community due to their HIV status in the past year, compared to the 22.4% of female sex workers and 14.7% of PWIT and 12.6% of the MSM. And among gender, and compared with the general population, men is 7.5%, and the general population woman is 8.3%. And the number 4 important finding we found that's 45% of respondents reported not knowing whether there were any law in Vietnam to protect the PLHIV from discrimination. Yeah, next slide, please. Yeah, this slide shows you the key recommendation based on the key findings that I present in the above slide. So the time is running out, so I'm not going detail. So anyone who needs to know details, so we will share the report soon. So next slide,
we have
please.
a bit of extra time. Okay, good, great.
Yeah.
Go ahead. We'll give you a bit of extra time.
Yeah. For the key population engagement, this is a very important thing that I want to share with you. That VNP Plus members who are KP group leader living with HIV were involved in the study design process as a member of the research advisory board. And the second point is 1/3 of the recruited data collector were leader of KP groups or network. And another point is that we have a cooperate with KP group or network to recruit a respondent from their community by using a limited chain referral approach. And another engagement of the KP is after the initial results were obtained, we have organized the validation workshop with participation of the key stakeholder and the community member, where we invite the community member from a key population group like MSM, transgender women, PWIT, female sex work, and PLHIV. And we also have the separate session to with each of those groups to review the finding and comment on their validity and describe the possible reason for experience of stigma documented in the study, and to propose intervention to improve the situation. And the detailed recommendation in the previous slide is also come from the validation workshop with the meaningful of the community member who come from the KP population. Next slide, please. And for the challenges, we haven't got any challenges faced with the KP. And so here is the slide I mentioned about the challenges we face in throughout the process in general only. Yeah, not the faced with the KP. One of these challenges I think is quite important to share with you is that while 2 rounds of the stigma index were completed in previous year, we are limited our ability to accurately draw comparison across the time point. So change to research methodology in this round, as well as the sampling strategy, that's our pose challenges to measure change over the time. That's what we found here when we're working on the process of analysis. And other point is a long or complicated question, or some interviewer have difficulty in using smartphone or laptop, because all of us come from communities, so not familiar with that. And the red cap server problem, sometimes interview interruption, and sometimes we lost some data. Yeah, it's some of the challenges in general. Next slide, please. Yeah, the lesson learned. There are only 3 key lessons learned from our stigma index implementation. The first one is the involvement of government partner, UN agency, and stakeholder in the advisory board of the research is extremely helpful, not only during the field work, but also in use of the result advocacy process. And the second one is the data collector of the study, including KP and PLHIV, is an advantage not only in approaching interviewee, but also in the process of interviewing for information extraction or exploration. And the third one is coordinating with a KP group or network. Is the process of the selecting research participant is extremely important to select or to recruit the right research subject that we expect. Yeah, I think it's the last slide. Yeah, thank you. Up to you, Sophie.
That's great. Thank you so much. That was really important insight into engaging KP networks and how it practically worked in the implementation and some of the advantages. So that was really excellent. Now we're going to hear from Laurel Sprague, who's going to share with us a little bit about what it's like to support networks of people living with HIV.
Hello, colleagues. Thank you, Sophie. The short answer, right, of what it's like to support networks of people living with HIV is that it's always a pleasure and inspiring. And as you can see from the presentations that we just heard from GMP+, JN+, and VNP+, the work being done by PLHIV networks is absolutely outstanding. This is such an incredible, vigorous research project that's being led by networks of people living with HIV all over the world, and has been now since 2008, I believe, as Omar said. It's really remarkable. I think one thing to keep in mind, and then I'll say more of what I had planned to say, but one thing to just keep in mind is that networks of people living with HIV are conducting research that is more extensive than many academics who work in research institutions or at universities ever do in their life. A survey, doing interviews, extensive interviews with 1,000 interviewees is, and then analyzing the data, working with the community to get the data analysis right, and then using that data it just boggles the mind, really, that we're doing this as a community-led research process, and it's remarkable. So thank you to GMP Plus and ICW for organizing this this webinar and for inviting me to speak. I have to say, as I was listening to the research results, I had this common experience of being both elated by the incredible work by the networks and also heartbroken at the data that we're seeing, which in the year 2022, so this is data collected over the last 3 years, it shows just an incredible amount of suffering that people living with HIV are experiencing in countries, and really demonstrates the urgency for us to work on this. I was keeping track of the people who are here, and I wanted to mention all of the regions that are represented, and now I've realized every region is represented. So we're really happy to have people here from every region, including with time zones that are difficult. Particularly, I see a lot of attendees who are long-term activists. I've known you for a while, you've known me for a while. Also long-term survivors that I've known for a while. So it's lovely to see you continuing the fight here. I see a lot of youth activists as well, which is exciting, and happen to know that a number of youth activists are also long-term survivors in this group. So it's really a powerful, powerful miniature AIDS conference that we're holding right now. So what I wanted to speak to is the role of the rest of us. So it's clear that this is a project that needs to be, in fact, it is required to be led by networks of people living with HIV, and it is. So what is the role of the rest of us in making sure that that is the case, that people living with HIV are leading? And when I say the rest of us, I'm talking about UN agencies, we're talking about donors, talking about academics, we're talking about civil society networks and organizations that are not people living with HIV. We also have a really important role to play here. And let me move forward by saying that I've been working on the Stigma Index research in different capacities since 2008. And I have never in that time, and this is surprising, I think, in a way, but I have never since 2008 seen a PLHIV network that could not implement, that was not able to implement the PLHIV Stigma Index. And of course, networks have different levels of experience and different levels of strength. So we have really strong PLHIV networks who in some cases have implemented the Stigma Index 2, even 3 times now. We also have newer and emerging networks that maybe have never implemented a stigma index. They all need to be at the same level of leadership and have the same amount of same level of leadership in terms of their role in leading the stigma index. And they need to have the same level of support from us. And again, it's absolutely possible because we've been watching this happen since 2008, and the networks have come through every time. So I thought that I would say the first step in supporting PLHIV leadership is to not undermine PLHIV leadership. And I think I wanted to say that because I think that different ones of us end up, hopefully completely unintentionally, undermining PLHIV leadership. And there's some key things we can do first and foremost to make sure we don't undermine the leadership of people living with HIV. So what undermines it? 1, holding meetings that don't include the PLHIV network, even if those meetings are planning, organizing, especially if they're organizing, maybe trying to troubleshoot problems. The PLHIV network needs to be in the meetings, part of the organization from the very beginning. If they're excluded, obviously their leadership is undermined. Donor rules that don't allow funds to go to the PLHIV network, that undermines PLHIV leadership. It's really hard to lead when the funds, you have to petition someone else to pay for the things that need to happen. Clearly your leadership role is compromised. Inadequate budgets and inadequate timelines, I think, are maybe the chief culprit in undermining PLHIV leadership, because you can't lead when you don't have enough funding and when you are under such compressed time schedules that the decisions are being made without proper consultation and engagement by people living with HIV. And the final 2 points, failing to translate documents into local languages that the people living with HIV speak undermines leadership by people living with HIV. And finally, tokenism. And in this case, by tokenism, I mean hiring people living with HIV to do interviews and collect data, but not involving people living with HIV in the leadership, the management, the data analysis, the data interpretation, etc. So those are things I think to really highlight, to watch out for. So what does support PLHIV leadership? One, let me give a shout out to PEPFAR again. PEPFAR's requirement that in every country receiving PEPFAR funds, the stigma index be implemented every 3 years does support PLHIV leadership. The rules support PLHIV leadership, and the focus and funding for implementation supports PLHIV leadership. Beyond that, there are 3 levels where we need to support this leadership. One is the global level, and this we are doing as UNAIDS with partners. Others are doing it as well, but we do working particularly with Johns Hopkins University, who I would say is the gold standard in academic support that doesn't take over the role of people living with HIV, but actively works to identify what kinds of technical support needs are there and to support those. And so Johns Hopkins has been working with GMP Plus and ICW over the last few years to make sure there is comprehensive technical support for networks at country level. We also, from the global level, we work with UNAIDS country offices and other partners to troubleshoot issues that might arise to support leadership of people living with HIV in all their diversity, including key populations living with HIV. And we also have ongoing communication with PEPFAR, USAID, NIH, Global Fund, and others, particularly that are funding stigma indexes to remove roadblocks. The regional level, I just want to give a couple examples. Let me make sure I'm reaching time here. Okay, just a couple examples. Right now, both our West and Central Africa office and our Eastern and Southern Africa regional offices are supporting PLHIV networks in order to convene and organize regional reports that bring together key findings from across the region, which will be really useful for advocacy. But again, this is supporting the networks to be able to lead the process. We also know in Latin America and the Caribbean that our regional office is supporting the regional coordination by networks in a regional implementation of the stigma index. And probably most critical is the country level, because the stigma index is implemented at country level. And here, I'd just like to give a couple examples of ways that PLHIV leadership is and can be supported. And let me start by recognizing our really good colleague who we lost last year, Manuel de Quinta, who was in Argentina. It was his final post with us. He, in Argentina, supported the network of young people living with HIV, and then particularly young women living with HIV, to lead the research project in Argentina. And I think it's really important to recognize that networks of young people living with HIV can lead the stigma index implementation and do a brilliant job. And that's what we saw in Argentina, or are seeing. A couple of good practices, and I will note our country office in Iran, but I know this is happening in other places as well. But our country office in Iran has been instrumental in helping to balance the power between the academic partner doing the data analysis and the protocol development for the network and the network itself, to make sure that the network actually gets influence in making sure that the protocol is followed, that the standard methodology is followed, and that they're involved in the research and dissemination throughout the process. That office has also been particularly strong in supporting our work to have an ethics approval process at country level that does follow the standard methodology, which means it is inclusive of key populations living with HIV, and they have helped us figure out how to navigate to make sure that all people living with HIV are included. A couple other just quick examples, and these are just some examples. There's lots of ways to support. We heard from a meeting in West and Central Africa that GMP Plus and ICW convened, I think, 2 weeks ago, that the engagement of UNAIDS country offices, and I assume this would extend to other UN partners and other country, major stakeholders, the engagement of UNAIDS country offices made all the difference in the outcome and also the efficiency of the research process. So being there to support at every stage makes, it is essential. It really does help the network lead the way they need to lead. We know that our office, for example, in Pakistan, has been a brilliant champion in making sure that the information about the standard methodology and the process is shared, and supporting the PLHIV leadership in Pakistan. Again, just some examples. We know in Ghana there was support for capacity building of the network, which was needed in order to move forward. And we saw the lovely example from Jamaica of the research, and know that we've been able to support the advocacy focus to support the network to be able to move forward with some of the advocacy planning. So just a few examples. I'm sure my time is up, so let me cede the floor so we can go to your questions. Thank you again.
Thank you, Laurel. I think those examples that you gave are really, really critical. And also I loved what you touched on in terms of, supporting, but really creating space, not smothering or holding back the networks, but really creating this kind of platform and support for them to do their thing and really lead and kind of get these implementations done in a deep and meaningful way that can really provide rich data. At this point, we're going to open it up for questions. And I know a few people have put some questions in the Q&A. And what I'd like to start with in terms of a question is really to ask the panelists to touch on something that Laurel said. Why, this is a research, right? This is a robust research methodology that's meant to be comparable. Why shouldn't this just be done by an academic institution? What is the kind of the benefit and the value of having people living with HIV running, leading, and driving this research? And I'll turn it over to anybody from the panel who wants to take a shot at that question.
I'm happy to start if I may.
Great.
Yeah, I think we've been we, meaning PLHIV community, we've been an object of research for so many times and in different areas. And I think it's a very different fight and dynamic when we are the one who's leading and own the documentation or the evidence gathering process. So it's very important that we lead that because we know what we should look at. Instead of relying on researcher with their theoretical knowledge and trying to go to a direction that might not suit to our needs. So I think that's really the main reason why it is very important that PLHIV Stigma Index or the evidence gathering process on HIV-related stigma is led by PLHIV, because we know what to investigate, what we should look at deeply. Thanks.
Thank you, Omar. Jamoke, I see you put your camera on, and I was going to ask you because I think you might have some really powerful insights into how networks can kind of overcome hostile environments as well, for particular key populations. So maybe you can share your reflection and maybe respond to that particular challenge.
Right, thank you. So in addition to the points Omar made, what we have recognized at GenPlus is that the people living with HIV in Jamaica, as you would have seen from the findings, continue to battle with their dignity, with their self-stigma. So to be in the presence of somebody who is titled a researcher or a scientific researcher, I'm not going to be willing to share what are my experiences with a particular setting, for example, healthcare and the type of stigma and discrimination that I face. I may believe that you're just here to fulfill a requirement based on the needs of the facility, and you're probably working with them for this particular research or study. So to know that in front of me is somebody who is also living with HIV, wanting to know my experience, wanting to know what is happening to me, wanting to know if the services are even good or even if they're bad. Knowing that I can relate to that person as somebody living with HIV gives me a calm, gives me that, okay, this person I can open to, this person I can talk to, and this person will listen to me and reflect on my sharings and my concerns in this particular survey. So that is important in terms of the utilization of people living with HIV for the stigma index. And like Omar said, we have long been used to people coming in from different countries or people who are not associated or part of the community coming to use us as targets, as numbers, or as research objects for these types of surveys. So that should change, that has been changing, and we are very much appreciative that we're utilizing community of people living with HIV more in terms of these findings, to know what is actually happening on the ground, to know what type of advocacy and moving forward that we need to do. Utilizing community, the engagement of other key population is also very important. In some countries, there may be hostility in terms of the engagement of communities. There may be no safe space. So a network, an NGO that provides services for people living with HIV, doing this type of work is an assurity for that population or for those communities that there is somebody out there advocating on their behalf or representing them, whether it's in the HIV response or the broader global development world, because we continue, especially here in the Caribbean, to battle with being recognized as not just objects or participants of a survey, but people with dignity, people who are essential and important to the productivity and the development of our country, and not just seen as disease carriers or virus carriers, but as equal and important people in terms of moving forward, whether it's in the HIV response or the broader global, broader development world. And I'll stop there.
Great, that's excellent. I think that's a really important thing that we don't always think about, is that safe space within the actual research that can create the opportunity for people to tell the truth about their experience and feel confident and comfortable to share some of those deeply personal and sometimes traumatic experiences. So I think that's really valuable contribution, Jumoke, and I thank you for that. Rita, who has put a question in the chat, which I think is a great one. What is, we mentioned that we're going to try to, and we've been scaling up our capacity at global level to really provide strong support. What's the benefit of running a stigma index every 2 to 3 years? Isn't the time frame too short for us to really observe changes, or what do we anticipate being able to do within that 2 to 3 year time frame? I know that that's a little bit of a tough question, so I don't know who wants to take that one. Panelists on the spot, but what's the benefit of doing this every 2 to 3 years?
If others don't mind, I can speak to that. Or Omar, would you prefer? Okay, just I was at the meetings representing GMP Plus some years ago when we revised the questionnaire and started working on the new methodology. And that's when the decision was taken that this should be run every 3 years where possible. And Rita, it's a really good question because it's a challenging balance to manage. The reason was that when we look at, while we know that changing attitudes is a long-term process, sometimes we get so set on the long-term process that we forget to have some accountability in the short term. And I think this helps, for one thing, PEPFAR, who is now committed to doing anti-stigma work in the countries where they fund, it helps them to track whether things are changing in the shorter term, in the 2 to 3 year time period. 1 year, too short, but I think we really need to start saying people need to be able to change. And these are rights and justice and healthcare access issues. These things need to be able to change, at least to some extent, within 2 or 3 years, so that we're not just doing research upon research upon research, but we can actually hold people accountable when things don't change. So I think it's a really hard discussion about what the right time period could be, but I really welcome this focus on the countries and people should be changing and rights should be being protected, and we could see something within a 2 or 3 year time period.
Great. Omar, did you want to add to that, or has Laurel.
Yeah, just very quickly, I think when we talk about changes, of course, when we focus on policy changes, which might require some time to see the impact, but we also are targeting a programmatic changes, and this should happen, more fast compared to policy changes. And even sometimes programmatic changes are really important and really key, because sometimes that's what saves people's lives. And we need to be able to capture that changes and trends. And on top of that, we have a global target to reduce stigma and discrimination by 2030, less than 10% of PLHIV, reporting experiencing stigma and discrimination. So in order for us to be able to reach that target, we need to set up a very a good monitoring process, and stigma index is one of the way that we monitor progress as we move forward towards 2030. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Omar. I just want to ask a question of Dong, because in your presentation, Dong, you mentioned that you had really worked closely with KP networks to kind of implement the methodology. And I just wondered, as a little sneak preview for the next webinars that we'll be having, do you have any thoughts about how that kind of engagement in the research is setting your community up for stronger advocacy on the recommendations, or what your thoughts are about that?
Yes, I think because we are going to start with the advocacy process. So we hope that the involvement of the KP will help us to use the most effective way of the stigma index for the advocacy.
Great, excellent. I think it's just important to be thinking about the whole, as Omar kind of talked about in the beginning, the whole cycle, and how, when we start as we mean to go on, and think about how we're really setting up this process to have a strong impact, as Omar elaborated in his comments about just a few seconds ago about this process and kind of what we can do in 2 to 3 years. So I'm conscious that we're coming up on time, but I do want to ask kind of a broader question, and this is really to I think Omar, you're best positioned to ask this. There are a lot of questions in the chat. I don't know if we'll be able to get to all of them, but I do want to ask a question about the way that the Stigma Index partnership has really scaled up its ability to support networks, and kind of, can you reflect on some of the ways that we're now collectively in a stronger position to really support networks around the world?
Thanks, Sophie. I think I need to acknowledge that when we deliver the technical support, it's not solely GNP+, it's the whole partnership with ICW, with UNH headquarters, as well as our technical partners from Johns Hopkins University. And by having this partnership, that is actually allow us to provide more, a comprehensive technical support from different angles. ICW, of course, are really key in making sure that the gender focus process is happening throughout the implementation. Hopkins will make sure that the research methodology is acceptable and accordingly within the research community. So with this partnership and on top of that, with a commitment from PEPFAR, which really provide us a huge opportunity to really scaling up our work, has been really key in this past 2 years. So I think starting from mid 2020, where we launched the standardized methodology, we managed to provide a comprehensive technical support to over than 50 countries. So that's really something that we are proud of as a GNP+, and also on behalf of the international partnership. And we hope to be able to keep on improving our work in supporting the network in implementing Stigma Index. Thanks.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much, Omar. That was really comprehensive. And I think, and thank you for the shout out to ICW, where we've been really excited to scale up our work to make sure that, there's a strong gender focus and gender analysis, even as we also scale up and strengthen focus on key populations. I don't think we'll have time, unfortunately, today to answer all of the questions that have come up. But guess what? Very excitingly, we're going to have more webinars. So there'll be more opportunities to ask these questions, and we will try to respond to all the questions outside of this forum. I did just want to give any of the panelists who feel they have something burning that they want to say, a burning reflection that they want to share, just to kind of share with us their closing thoughts. And then I'll give a little bit of information about the next webinars, and we will say thank you. So Jumoke, I see you put your camera on.
Yes, thank you very much. So the importance of the Stigma Index and also community-led response as a whole is critical and important to the local HIV response as well as the global HIV response. The importance of engagement of community of people living with HIV and those that are impacted are going to be very important in terms of programmatic response, in terms of advocacy, in terms of policy, in terms of law changes and the changes and transformation that we want to see globally in terms of reducing the numbers, getting people virally suppressed, getting people better health outcomes and empowered as a world, as a country. And so I believe more opportunities like the Stigma Index and however else we can explore utilizing community to reach community is going to be very important as we move forward. We need to get more buy-in from governments, from the broader stakeholders, not just funders and technical partners, but also the governments of these countries, especially with high HIV rate of infection, where communities are marginalized and disenfranchised, and go into those countries and those places where that is happening and empower and embolden and get partnership on board, because that is important in terms of moving forward. We have seen that work here in Jamaica in relation to the Stigma Index, in terms of the growth of JN+, in terms of our work expanding beyond what we normally do and getting various partners on board and broadening the scope of what we need to do in terms of meeting the needs of people living with HIV here in Jamaica. So I think stuff like these need to be promoted. Stuff like these in terms of community-led response need to be effective and a part of the broader response nationally and globally for us to move forward effectively. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. And I think unless there are any other kind of really pressing comments, I think Jumoke has given us an excellent call to action to consider the ways in which all of us who are in the audience and working at global level can keep our eye on the outcomes that we want here in terms of really shifting stigma and discrimination, really making headway on reducing and eliminating stigma and discrimination from the local level, all the way up. And I think with that, I will remind everyone that we do have 2 webinars in this series that are coming up, where we'll kind of be digging a little bit more deeply into the aspects of how implementations are driving advocacy, and also a little bit more into kind of what is the standardized methodology and how our networks really implementing this methodology. So there's more to learn. We will be announcing the dates of those upcoming webinars shortly. And I would really like to give a strong thank you to all of our panelists who brought such a great depth of practical information about the implementations and an understanding, really from the ground level where implementation is happening, all the way up to kind of the policy and practice at the global level, which is creating, safe spaces for these kinds of implementations and for this excellent research that's so necessary. I will acknowledge there are a lot of questions in the chat. As we said, we'll try to answer them outside of this forum. And with that, I thank you all very much for this great panelist and also for the strong audience engagement. Perhaps we'll need to make our next webinar a little bit longer so that we can get to everyone's questions. But I thank you all very much. And with that, thank you. The recording will be shared. And we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar.
Thanks so much, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks.